All right. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. So this is a live session. This is going to be recorded for those of you that want to get the session afterwards, or if you weren't able to join us live, so that you will also be able to get this in your email. And today, Ray, we're going to be talking about the strategic roadmap. This is for us. This is exciting because we're preparing to launch our new training program for our English-speaking fellows. And basically, what we are going to be briefly talking about today is a very condensed version, a summary almost in a little bit less than an hour about the program that we teach, everything in it. Why do we say that strategy is kind of taking a hike or a journey into the mountains, Ray?
Well, we like to use the analogy of strategy being a hike up a mountain because number one, strategic management, strategic planning, and execution is a journey. And you always have an objective in mind. For us, the objective is reaching the summit, right? And along the way, it will be a tough hike. You will have to come prepared. You will have to make adjustments as you go, depending on things like the weather. And we like to use this analogy because it translates really well, because the summit is an objective. A lot of, if you talk to a lot of, more advanced hikers or people that really like to go all out on climbing mountains, there's this idea of a North Star that guides them. For us, that's our purpose and that's our vision. And organizations have to set their mind on the purpose and the vision, set their mind on the summit, and they got to climb it. So we like to use that analogy. And what we're going to cover today is kind of this approach to not only strategic management, but strategic planning. We see a gap in how organizations manage planning their strategy, executing their strategy. And one of the things that we try to do is that we try to provide you guys an approach, a very comprehensive approach to tackling these common issues that we see in strategic planning.
That's exactly right, Ray. So you touched a few important points there. So your purpose, that's the North Star. It's always there. It's always in the sky. It's always guiding you. The summit, that's the next place that you want to get. It will typically be your strategic vision. Where do you want to get as a company? Probably the one that you mentioned is it also depends on where you're starting from. So your base camp, it could be like a few throws of a stone away, or it can be 10,000 feet away from that summit. So depending on how far you are, the size of that challenge will be different. And as you very gracefully put it, you also need to walk that path. You need to get up that mountain. And as you're getting up that mountain, conditions and things might change, and you need to be able to adapt to that. Actually, I've also heard that strategy now is also not only like climbing a mountain, but also like flowing with a river. And within this flow of a river, you need to be able to adapt to every curve and turn in the way, because conditions will be continuously changing and we need to keep it flexible. So as you were saying, that is what we're going to be talking about today, and this is strategic roadmap. We in Purpose Lab, Ray, because we haven't actually made a proper introduction for ourselves. So in Purpose Lab, we've been doing this for 15 plus years. We specialize in continuous improvement, in strategic planning, and strategic management for organizations. And basically what we want to do is we want to make sure that organizations of all shapes and sizes, that they can take the concepts and apply them to their reality, that they can build a custom-made, a tailored suit that's different for every organization, because that is something that we need to understand. The strategy will need to be different for every organization, and we want to make this available for everyone, right?
Yes, exactly.
All right, so very quickly, today we're going to be talking about what strategic management is. We are also going to be covering a few points about what an effective strategy is. Then why are we calling this the strategic management roadmap, where we will be hitting a few of those milestones that we need to take into account along the way, and also how do we make sure that we are building this tailor-made approach for whichever customer that we are facing, right? And by the end of today, we're also going to be showing a strategic barometer where every one of you will perhaps be able to make a little bit of a self-assessment and say, well, this is where I believe I'm standing. And of course, you'll get information about the training program that we have for you as well. Okay. So with that being said, Ray, is there anything else that you want to add before we get started?
No, let's jump right in.
Okay. All right. So let's get into that. So what is strategy? How would you start to define strategy, Ray?
Well, I would take a look at a few definitions that are commonly used. I would take a look at what kind of the industry experts say about it. There's a few things that strategy is. Strategy is a plan, right? Whether you are in marketing, whether you are trying to launch a new product, whether you're trying to penetrate a new market, whether you are looking to diversify your product, you always need a plan. You need a course of action. You need objectives. You need to structure that, and you need to find a way to get your whole organization to buy into that plan. This is probably one of the hardest parts about strategy is getting your organization behind the plan and executing it. We like to say that planning is just half the work, right? The other half of it is actually doing the work and executing on your strategy. So how about let's take a look at some of these definitions, and let's take a look at how these industry experts define strategy, and let's just highlight really quickly what those components of a strategy are.
Okay, all right. So you talked about having a clearly defined destination. If we take a look at the picture, that might be your point B, or if we fall back to our summit or our mountain example, that is precisely the summit of our mountain. And how to get there? How to get there depending on where you're starting from. So that is what strategy is about. And as you're saying, well, Michael Porter, Anna Mooney, Michelle Planella, Frederick Taylor, they all might have different definitions, but they all have these elements in common. Now, when we put all of that together, Ray, we end up kind of with an overarching definition almost, where we talk about how strategy or strategic management is about formulating, executing, evaluating, and adjusting decisions that you follow to achieve your organizational objectives. And this, in turn, is bringing you closer to realizing your vision. Now, this is very important for us, Ray, because as you were mentioning earlier, we are not only talking about strategic planning. Strategic planning is only part of it. It all happens in your base camp, if I will, right? So we actually need to take a few steps outside of the base camp and then start climbing that mountain, start taking the hike. So strategic management is not only about the planning portion of it. Yes, of course, that is an important piece and is a part that every organization typically enjoys, but it's very important to understand that if you only plan and if you do a very good plan, but if you don't execute, that plan is not really worth anything, right? So a lot of the value is in the execution, and that execution needs to come from a good enough plan that will take you there. But we also need to be aware that, as we were saying earlier, as you're climbing that mountain, conditions might change. New summits will perhaps, you will come into your vision, and you need to be able to be fluid enough as part of this process of continuous strategic analysis to know, well, this is where we're currently standing. Are we getting closer to where we're going to get? Do we need to change, or do we need to adapt anything? And that is the whole process of strategic management, including planning, execution, and governance of this strategy. Right. So we also talk about how to define an effective strategy. Now, when we think about ways in which a strategy is effective, there are another set of elements that we might take a look at. For once, I might say, well, it's actually influencing the purchase or the use decision for your target, right? So sometimes, if you're a for-profit organization, then perhaps your client, your customer is buying something from you. If you're a non-for-profit, or perhaps if you're a government instance, then perhaps it'll be something different. But it definitely influences and affects the experience that the user is having and makes you different from the competition, right? It gets you closer. It gets you closer to where you're going. So it also needs to pass these performance tests. That's the second test. So it makes you different, or it influences the buying decision. It helps you getting where you're going to get. So that's the performance test. And it's also adaptable to an ever-changing environment. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And you touched on probably what I would argue are the three most important aspects of a strategy. It needs to be flexible. You need to affect your customers' purchasing decisions. You have to make it easier for your customer to choose you. If your strategy is not involving that element of a focus on the customer, then you're not really having a strong strategy. Of course, once you affect your customer's decision-making process, you're automatically different from the rest, right? And what you have to do is, once you achieve that differentiation, or you'll oftentimes hear competitive advantage, right? You need to make it hard to imitate that competitive advantage, right? What we call a sustainable competitive advantage. If you make it, if you change a few things and you don't continue to evolve and change your strategy and your business model, people can easily copy you. So you have to make it difficult for the competition to copy what you're doing. And that means being flexible. And a lot of times what people think about, when it comes to, difficult to imitate, they oftentimes think of an innovative solution, right? It could be software, it could be this idea. But in reality, there's a lot of simpler things that you can do in your organization to make you different from the rest, right? Whether it's how fast you make decisions, whether it's your organizational structure, are you lean, are you agile, do you have a flat organization, the resources, your employees' capability, all those kinds of things. Your organizational culture are one of the most difficult things to imitate. So those are some things that you have to keep in mind when you're designing a strategy.
Absolutely. And I just want to double stress the adaptable part, adaptability. Your strategy needs to be able to adapt. Long gone are the days in which you could plan for the next 10 years, 5 years, even 2 years, even probably the next semester or the next quarter. I mean, you need to be very clear on what your objectives are, where do you want to get, but you also need to be able to adapt as eventualities come upon, as things change in the market, in the environment. And all that is part of what we need to be ready for in today's strategic landscape, right?
Yeah.
So in order for this, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to summarize real quick with this slide. How can we summarize what an effective strategy is in 3 easy elements, right? Number 1, you got to have a competitive advantage. Number 2, your strategy has to continuously evolve. And last but not least, strategy needs to be creative. You need to find, a lot of times you'll hear today that innovative ideas can no longer be created. That's not necessarily true. A lot of times we can adopt creativity. A lot of people think that innovation is not something that is just easily found. It's kind of like this. It's kind of like gold when you kind of stumble upon it, where an organization doesn't really know how to unlock innovation. It doesn't really understand how it can encourage innovation. But that's one of the things that we focus on, is how can we build up creative leaders? How can we create more sustainable and creative strategies using these tried and true methods and frameworks for kind of harnessing that innovation or that innovative side into people? But those are kind of the 3 things that we can summarize into what makes a strong strategy today. Now, 20 years ago, what made a strong strategy was very different, right? Strategy was a lot more linear. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, strategy was a lot more linear. It was all about beating the competition, right? Being better. And you can only do that really with a trade-off between cost and value, right? Nowadays, it's not like that anymore. You can create value while also reducing cost. It's not, the 2 are not mutually exclusive, meaning that, oh, if I increase value, then I must increase my costs. That's not really what's true today. So we need to find ways to be more creative. How can we stand out and not directly compete on price, which is a lot of times what it comes down to when it comes to a strategy. That's not how modern day strategies work.
That is also correct, right? So basically, we need to put together this smart strategy, effective strategy that you're talking about, with the proper execution, as we're saying. And these are also some of the points or some of the reasons why we're calling this a strategic roadmap, because what we want to share is how to get there, how to get to that effective strategy, right? So we need to talk about specific steps or specific milestones that we need to be covering, and we want to make sure, as I was also saying earlier, that we can adapt to every organization. So there is a constellation of tools, of principles, of ideas out there, all related to strategic planning, strategic management, strategic governance, strategic execution, strategic principles. So how do you put 2 and 2 together, and where do you start? This is where Purpose Lab, this is where we built the Purpose Lab model, and where we try to show you how all of that puts together. What are some of those best practices that you don't need to use everything at the same time? And this is the strategic management process that we put together. I'd like to think of ourselves, Ray, sometimes as if we were curators in a museum, right? There are so many great pieces of artwork out there, and we need to choose the right ones. But every exhibit, every case is different. Every room is going to be different. So we need to choose the right artwork for every one of them. There are different steps that we're going to be going through, but they're not the same. I mean, they're generally structurally the same for every organization, but what goes inside each one of those rooms or what happens during each one of those steps needs to be adapted to the reality of every organization. Starting from the very top, right, from the very beginning, which is how to work with the foundations of what we're trying to do. So the first thing that we do is we talk about three elements: strategic models, organizational structure, and strategic frameworks that will help us build the strong foundations for our organization. And that we call this outer circle, and that's kind of like the tailor-made structure for every organization, right? It all starts there. Then we also need to think about the core of this process. The why are we doing what we're doing? This is where we go into the DNA process of the strategic management. This is where we talk about the philosophy with an organization, some concepts that perhaps you're very familiar with, purpose, vision, mission, value. But we also want to make sure that we are able to connect this DNA with building the future of the organization, so that it doesn't stop at being something like very philosophical, but that we can actually bring it down to earth and say, well, this philosophical pieces, they translate into this objectives, into this focus areas that we want to work with. That's also connected with the foundation. So this first two elements are kind of where we start, and we'll be delving into each one of them a little bit more during the rest of today's session, right? But once we have this outer circle and once we have this inner circle of the core, the central axis of the model, right, then we can go into this kind of this middle cycle, as I like to call it. It's kind of like an arrow because you're constantly cycling through it. This where am I, where are we going to do it, and how we're going to be doing it, right?
Yeah. So the where am I is just assessing where we're at. And what you might find, I'll just kind of make this side note, but what you might find is that in your strategic planning journey, if you're starting a brand, if you're building a business, if you're trying to bring something to market, you might have some of these elements. So what's great about what we do is that you could take some of these pieces and adopt them into your planning process. So when we talk about where am I, we're talking about how what is my strategic analysis, right? What are my current challenges? What am I facing? This is where we will talk about SWOT, right? What we do or what will we do is this is where we're going to start generating some strategies. How are we going to achieve our vision, right? And then the last one, this is when we get into the execution. So how are we going to act it out? How are we going to do this? How are we going to implement this? How am I going to cascade this throughout my organization? And you might find yourself in a different position if you're in a small, medium, large organization. But it's great that with this process, we're going to kind of lay out all these kind of different tools, and we're going to jump into how you can use them depending on your unique situation and circumstance.
Okay, so as you're executing, and this is why we also call it a cycle, you'll constantly continue to assess, well, where am I now? I mean, you started somewhere, you determine what to do, you start executing, and then as the cycle continues to move along, where are you at that point in time? Do you need to adjust your strategy? Can you continue working on when you determine that you want it to work? So this is why this internal process is a cycle. The foundational pieces, this outer circle that we're going to be talking about more in just a minute, it's probably a little bit more set. It's not written in stone. It also adapts with the rest of the organization, but perhaps the revision cycle of that, or the revision cycle is just a little bit longer. The core, the inner circle, the central axis for it, Ray, the why probably is that North Star that keeps guiding you, even though that you know that you're very likely not going to be getting exactly there. It's kind of this philosophical purpose, why you're doing what you're doing, but it comes together with some other elements like what's the concrete summit, where do you see yourself, your organization a few months, a few years from now, and how do you translate that into specific strategic objectives? So what do you say if we take a quick jump into every one of these elements, Ray?
Let's do that. Yeah.
Okay, right. This is going to be very quick. I mean, this is part of our about 48-hour training process, and today we're trying to condense it in under an hour for all of you folks. So hopefully this is useful and you get a good idea of where everything is going to be taking you. So let's start with the outer circle, the foundational elements, right? And as I was saying, there are three basic elements that we want to touch upon here. One of that is your strategic hierarchy or your organizational structure. It will help you and know what kind of organization do you have, the size of organization, how are you organized, or how are you structured, because every organization is going to be a little bit different. Then, as part of this foundation, this tailor-made solution, we also need to talk about the strategic model, which is kind of this, also the wireframe that we're going to be using to put all the pieces together, and then the strategic frameworks, that is, how are you going to be classifying your strategic objectives, your strategic initiatives, so that you can focus where you need to focus. All right. So let's take a look at the first one of those, the strategic hierarchy or the organizational structure rate.
Sure.
Every organization will have different levels, right?
Yeah, every organization has a different organizational structure. Now, when you start planning your strategy, you first have to consider your organizational structure. What is an organizational structure? It's just the way that your organization functions. I even like to say that it's your organizational culture, right? How do things get cascaded? Meaning, how do you pass different tasks? How do you pass different objectives down your organization? One of the key things here is that when you're developing your strategy and you touch on this subject on your organizational structure, we're not looking for a deliverable here. We're just trying to understand how our organization functions, how our business functions. We like to teach 4 different levels, right? These 4 levels, their separation may not always be clear in every organization, right? If you're in a small company, let's say that you manufacture some products, but you don't have this giant facility, you might have only 3 of these levels, right? Maybe it's just you. Maybe you're the only one running your business and you take care of all of these levels. But all of these are kind of true to how an organization operates, right? You need a corporate level. The corporate level is the one who kind of defines the DNA, the vision, the mission, the values, where are we going, the objectives, how are we going to grow? The next level down is our business unit, right? These are people that define strategies, indicators, tasks, activities. And then a level down, we have our functional or departmental level. This is where we have, say, marketing. This is, say, where you have your operations, you have sales, you have HR. These are people who, this level receives those strategies. They're not the ones designing the strategies, but they're the ones receiving these strategies, and they're the ones formulating those activities and executing on those activities. Our last level is operational. A lot of times you'll see that functional and operational blend into one, depending on your organization. These 4 distinct levels are more true in larger organizations. But if you are in a smaller organization, they might blend. But operational, we're focusing here on the day-to-day tasks. Now, again, why is this really important to understand? Well, number one, you start to see how your objectives are going to cascade down, right? Depending on how many levels you have, that might dictate how many strategies you have, how many strategic levels you have, right? It also helps you determine your capacity. You're not going to start executing these super complex plans. You're not going to start developing 28 strategies with 50 focus areas if you only have 2 or 3 levels, right? So understanding your organizational capacity, understanding how all these different departments interact, who they report to, et cetera, is going to help you in structuring your strategy. But it's one of those first things that we take a look at when we work with organizations is first assess their organizational structure. How is this culture, and how is this back and forth between these different levels, right?
Right, and you made me think about a couple of examples for clients that we work with, Ray. So, for example, one of them is not that big of an organization, actually more on the smaller side, probably 60-something people. Their annual revenue is probably in the realms of between 2 and 3 million. So it's not a very large organization. The management group for this organization, their management team, is actually a smaller one. So it's 5 or 6 people that handle different areas, and these 5 or 6 people themselves, they represent the first 3 levels that we see here. So they themselves, they are corporate level, business units, and functional departments, for example, right? So they need to determine where they are going as an organization with the help of the founders that actually work as managers for this organization as well. And then they actually service different markets with different brands, with different products. So they also almost own the processes for different business units, and they're in charge of setting the goals and results for each one of these business units, but they're also the leads or the heads for every one of the departments that this smaller organization has. So all three levels they are there, but this organization might only be needing perhaps one strategic plan, and that's it. So every single level of the organizational or strategic hierarchy is there, but just the team that handles all of these elements is perhaps the same team. Now, if you think about a large organization, this is another client of ours. It's a large organization in the pharmaceutical industry, and they have in the hundreds of millions of revenue. And we got a call from one of the managers and say, well, we are the lead for the R&D division for this organization, and we want help with our strategic planning and strategic management, right? So first thing is to understand where we are sitting. If this is the R&D department, so that very likely is a functional department, a section for this organization, which is large enough that actually justifies that the department or the function itself has its own strategic plan. And that strategic plan actually needs to align with the objectives for different business units within the organization that has a worldwide market with different objectives. And they also need to align and support the corporate goals of the organization. But not only that, but their operation is also so big that it might even justify having specific strategic, not only initiatives, but perhaps full-blown plans, right, for their operations. So different factories, different warehouses might need their own strategic plan, mostly focused on improving and making their day-to-day operations most efficiently, but also properly aligned with the rest of the elements in the organization structure. So first thing first, understand the type of organization that you're in, where you're sitting within that organization, and how can you start working with that organization if you can do with only one plan, if you need several plans depending on the size of the organization, if you're on one team that actually has shared responsibility across different levels, or if you have an organization that's large enough to have specific teams that are in charge of different levels, strategically speaking. As you were saying earlier, this does not need to match the organizational structure, organizational tree or org charts that you're working with.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to strategic models and frameworks. Now, very clear, I just want to quickly highlight what the difference is between these two elements, strategic models and strategic frameworks. You'll oftentimes, depending on your background, you might hear these two words interchangeably. Here at Purpose Lab, we have two very distinct purposes for these two words, right? A strategic model helps us describe the elements that need to be included into our strategic plan, right? It's kind of like a blueprint. If you imagine an airport, let's say you want to build an airport, well, you know what an airport needs. You know it needs a landing strip, and everyone's got to lead to that, right? You need baggage claim, you need TSA check, you need check-in, you need waiting rooms, etc. The same thing we adopt for strategy, right? We want to be able to build kind of what the blueprint for our strategic model will be. Now, what should I consider when I'm choosing a strategic model, right? And we present three different strategic models. Again, we like to think of ourselves as curators, and we're showcasing these three. We did not invent these three, but what do we want to kind of consider when we're developing these? Number one, you kind of consider how often you want to make your revision cycles. If you're a very, like for example, let's just say if you're a more technology company, you might be focusing on something with a shorter revision cycle. You want to check up on those strategies and those objectives often. If you're kind of a more stable organization, then you kind of want a longer term plan. Well, then you might just need to check your strategy on a yearly basis and check in with your leaders on a monthly basis, right? But a lot of this is dependent on those two things. How frequent do you want to, revise your strategy? How frequent do you want to check it? And how are objectives going to flow down? So that's the main two things that we want to think about when it comes to a strategic model. How does this relate to strategic frameworks? Well, we can take a look at that in the next slide.
Correct. So perhaps here you start hearing some of the names that you might already be familiar with, or perhaps not. So you've heard about, for example, OKRs. In our model, an OKR, objectives and key results, this fits all the elements of a strategic model. Because as you were saying, Ray, it talks about a structure, it talks about a cadence or a frequency for reviewing or revising your strategic plan, there's also a Hoshin Kanri, which is the Japanese version or the Japanese model for strategy organization. It has a little bit more of a longer term vision, and then you break it down into yearly objectives, and then you align strategic KPIs and strategic projects and initiatives to every one of those objectives. And what we like to call the cascade model, the purpose lab model, which is kind of a mix and match of elements that you need to work here. But as you were saying, if you were building an airport, the first thing that you would do is determine which are the elements that an airport needs, right? You're perhaps not working on connecting all of them, but you know that you're going to be having the landing strip, you know that you're going to be having the baggage lounge, you know that you're going to be having the duty-free shops, all of that, all those elements, that is part of the strategic model. And as you're saying now, when you start putting all of that together, then you talk about the third and final element for this outer circle or for this foundation, which is the strategic framework. Names that you're probably familiar with that are related to strategic framework. You've probably heard of the Balanced Scorecard. That's a good strategic framework. Horizons 3 McKinsey, 3 Horizons for McKinsey, value discipline, stakeholder theory. Those are strategic frameworks. What's the difference? Well, for starters, in the airport with the model, you start to think about the building blocks. What is it that you're going to be using? In the framework, you're starting thinking about how are you going to be putting all of those together, right? So if it was an airport, do you want to have an airport to maximize travel speed? So you probably need to build slots that are closer together. You need to think about how can you make your clients walking through the airport more efficient, or perhaps if you want to maximize your on-site sales for the airport, then you want to think about how can we make sure that they spend the largest amount of time possible in our stores, and perhaps even make a revenue stream, an important revenue stream out of those stores, right? So depending on the focus that you want to give it, you'll have a different feel and look. Same thing happens with strategic frameworks. Different strategic frameworks will propose different focus areas where you're going to be working on your strategic objective. If you use, for example, a balanced scorecard rate, you are presented with 4 focus areas that you're given. So you will talk about learning and growth. You talk about your operational efficiency or your operations. You talk about your customer satisfaction. You talk about the finance or the results of the organization, and you start thinking about strategic objectives for every one of those. If you think about the McKinsey 3 horizons, then you think about horizon number 1, which is your immediate business, horizon number 3, which is your future business, and horizon number 2, which is the bridge that you need to close in order for you to be able to close the gap between your current business and your future business. So choosing the right strategic framework will depend, again, on where are you within the organization, where is your organization at in terms of time, in terms of size, in terms of maturity, and you need to use the one that will better fit your organization. We find so many clients that say, well, I read this book or I found this concept I want to implement, and then we need to ask, is that really what is going to be helping your organization the most? So you probably read Balanced Scorecard by Kaplan Norton, one of the better known strategic frameworks. That's a very solid, very concise strategic framework. We use it with many of our clients. However, it's not the best one for every one of our clients, because not every organization is in the right place and time for that strategic framework to be the best for them. Some of them actually get more benefits for using different ones. For example, we work with a lot of startups or scale-ups, and we sometimes propose a 3-section framework that has, well, you need to choose growth, you need to choose control, and you need to choose profitability. You need to choose 2 of them, and the other one, you need to know that you're not going to be able to be as strong as that one. So if you choose control and you choose profitability, perhaps you're going to be sacrificing a little bit of growth. So you need to be aware of those decisions, and then depending on the focus areas, each one of these categories or areas that I'm talking about, Ray, is actually what a strategic framework presents. And depending on those focus areas, you will then be able to match the strategic objectives for your organization.
Yeah. In other words, the strategic frameworks help you, they guide you through your planning process, right? So these are the 4 that we present here, kind of like the 4 that we group together. There are 1,500,000 more, but these are the ones that we think that are the strongest. And I just quickly, let's take Ansoff Matrix as an example, right? Your strategic model gives you the structure. If you if you saw on the strategic model, you saw one area that said focus area, right? This is what your strategic framework helps you define, right? So what are you going to focus on? Do you want to focus on developing a product, or do you want to focus on penetrating a new market? Or do you want to focus on building a new market? All of these things will dictate what kind of strategies you're going to implement in your organization. So essentially, just to kind of simplify everything, a strategic model is, how is your strategy structured? A framework is, okay, well then what do I really kind of want to achieve with my strategy, right?
All right. Okay, so that's your first milestone, Ray. So the outer circle. Now, together with that outer circle, we start working from the very beginning on the core of the model, strategic DNA, the why of the model. Basically, what we do here is we talk about some philosophical elements, vision, mission, values, purpose, but then we also want to connect this philosophy to building the future of the organization. You so often see organizations that they've done this incredible work of defining values of the organization, defining the vision, defining the mission, and then you see that those pictures or that hanging there in the wall, or just painting the word and the wall and the values, but they don't really mean anything more. And I'm not talking about every organization, but again, we see this very often. They don't really mean anything more for the way that the organization does its decision making and the way in which the organization builds the future. What we really want to make sure during this strategic DNA phase or process is that we are able to take that philosophy, which is, again, the heart of the organization. Why are we doing what we're doing? What is it that we're doing? And connect it, Ray. This is why it's also DNA, because it's kind of like this double-sided helix, right? Like just like with a cell in the DNA, one of the sides tells you what the other side actually tells you how to make that happen. In this case, that other side is building the future. So how do you connect that purpose, vision, mission, value to the focus areas and objectives? So for this, it is important that you've chosen the right strategic frameworks, the right strategic models, and that together with the Mars team, which is this small, coherent team of people that if you were going to be taking your organization to Mars, you would like to take with you in the limited space that a space aircraft allows, then what is it that you would like to achieve into every one of those focus areas? Those are your strategic objectives. We need to make very sure, Ray, that we don't step out of this strategic DNA phase without having very clearly defined focus areas and strategic objectives.
Yeah. So essentially, we don't usually help organizations define their vision, mission, and values. They already have them. What we do is we help them connect that to an envisioned future. One of the biggest pitfalls that I see with strategy is that this lack of acceptance amongst the team, amongst the organization. A lot of times that has to do because a lot of people don't understand the vision. They don't know where the organization wants to go, right? They don't understand where the organization wants to be in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So what we have to do with these elements is that, like Howell said, we connect them to a future. Just quickly, one of the ways that we like to do that is through kind of an exercise. We guide teams through asking them a question like, okay, let's say you achieved your vision, and let's say that let's say that an organization achieves their vision. What we ask them is, okay, if a magazine approached you, what magazine would it be? Would it be Forbes, right? Would it be National Geographic? I don't know. And then what's the title? What's the title on that magazine? What's on the cover? Is it your product? Is it your founder? What is on the cover? And what we help and what we do is we kind of guide these teams through that definition. What that does is that it creates this shared understanding of the vision. Where do we want to go? And from there, we can actually extract strategic objectives, focus areas. How are we going to get there is kind of the question that we try to ask. So that's that part of the strategic DNA. Now let's go into those three other processes that we had, starting with the analysis, right? Where are we currently at?
Right, and that exercise that you're talking about with envisioning or picturing the yourself or your organization or your team, the cover of magazine, Ray, I like to see it as a mental anchor, right? So if you were to close your eyes and picture yourself in the future, how would that look like? And then you build that mental anchor, that shared mental anchor with the team, and now you have something to aspire to together, a specific vision, not only kind of like this cloudy one, but something much more concrete that you're working towards. So once you have that, as you were saying, now you move into this middle cycle when you start by saying, well, where are we starting from? We said that a lot of the planning process happens in Basecamp, right? But that Basecamp can be just a few hundred feet away, or a good 1,000 feet away from the summit. So where are we standing? Where are we playing? And this is where strategic analysis comes into play. We'll go into analyzing the external elements for the organization using tools such as the Pastel analysis, political, ecological, social, technological, ecological, legal elements. The Porter's 5 forces. We'll talk about trends and things that are happening or that have happened over the past few years within the organization, the timeline, how our organization evolved. Your internal analysis, internal performance, what are some of the resources or capabilities that the organization has, whether they're valuable, rare, inimitable, and if we're able to capture them as an organization, how's our current performance. We'll also use another tool that you're probably familiar with, which is the business model canvas developed by Mr. Alex Osterwalder, and saying, well, what are we trying to use, or how are we trying to actually capture value for our market, for our user. And all of these elements in the strategic analysis rate actually takes you to start analyzing a much more deeper elements in the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, but not only through the typical brainstorm in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and we're done, but actually going through every one of these elements. And what I like to say here, and I'll let you speak in a minute, but what I like to say here as an example is, it's not the same to say, well, we want to increase our revenue by 15%. If you look back and you're coming for 5 years straight where your revenue has been declining, that if you look back and you're coming from three years straight where your revenue has been increasing 10 or 15 or 20%, right? The size of the challenge, the type of the challenge, and what you're facing is completely different based on where you're standing. And that is what the analysis phase is preparing us to do. This is like an immersion phase. Also, you were talking about this creative efforts that we'll be going through the formulation stage, but this is also a lot of that important elements, important information that we need to feed into our brains to get ready for that formulation stage as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I have nothing else to say about strategic analysis. I think you touched on it. The next phase here is our formulating strategies. My favorite part of the process, right? This is where we go through this process of generating these ideas. So we've got our models, we've got our structure, we've got our frameworks, we have an idea of where we want to go, we have an idea of what we want to achieve. We know what we're struggling with, we know what our opportunities are. Now let's get the team together and let's start formulating some strategies. And for us, the formulation phase is extremely immersive, it's extremely creative, and it acts like a funnel. What we want to focus on first is quantity over quality. We're not looking for the best ideas. You will often find that there is quality in quantity, right? So that's what we want to do in this first stage is ideate. We employ a lot of different techniques and methods. We use a lot of principles grounded in design thinking to help teams kind of formulate these strategies. We pose these questions, right? We call them creative questions. Well, design thinking calls them creative questions, but we're going to structure our problems, our issues into these creative questions that allow for an open discussion about how we can achieve a solution. So that's one stage here. The next stage is selection, right? We need to make sure that by the end of the ideation phase, we have a lot of ideas, right? Obviously, not all of those ideas are going to fly, but we're going to have some really strong candidates, and that's what we're going to do in the selection phase. We're going to use a lot of different tools in this phase to ensure alignment, right? We want to make sure that the projects and the initiatives that we're choosing are not only feasible, right? Meaning that they make sense for our organizational context. And that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about your organizational structure is, hey, are we prepared for something like this? Is my organization trained enough for something like this? Do I have enough people for this? And we want to make sure that we have that impact. Are these projects actually going to get us closer to the summit? Yes or no? And in the last and final phase, or step here in the phase, is validation. We do not want to just stop at the selection We find that that happens a lot. We want to make sure that your projects coexist, right? A lot of times you'll find that an organization will launch a project, only later find out that it goes against another project, right? Or you want one objective, but it doesn't sync really well with another department's objective. So how do we make sure that we can create that alignment? We have to validate that our strategies make sense, right? Another thing that we do here too is we start entering risk analysis. We do that through we call it pre-mortem analysis, where we ask, okay, let's just think about the worst case scenario. Let's say that all these projects went horribly wrong. We start to then work backwards. What went wrong? What could we do to mitigate that? And we start designing mitigation plans to address those risk areas within our strategy. And that, by the end, should conclude our this section. Of course, we have to structure these strategies to be supported by projects, right? You have your objective, you know what you want to achieve. Here, we're developing those projects that are going to get us to that objective.
There's actually a very close relationship between this specific stage and the design thinking concepts, right? Where you say, well, we need to come up with a bunch of ideas. So that's why we start with ideation, focusing more on quantity of ideas more than quality of ideas. Of course, this is for challenges that you don't previously know how you're going to be tackling, right? If you have some objectives that you already know what you need to do in order for you to achieve your objective, then by all means, just turn that into a plan and start working on that. But in many occasions, you have an objective and you say, well, we don't really know how we're going to be achieving those goals, right? So if that is the case, you start working with some creative techniques, as you were saying earlier, so that you can start working on coming up with this bunch of ideas, and then you select those ideas that are better suited during the selection phase. And in the validation process, I was actually thinking of an example of another client of ours. Is that one of the areas of the department said, well, we want to improve our level for customer service, and in order for us to do that, we need to increase our inventory levels. Why? Well, because that will allow us to have a quicker response for our clients, and whatever they need, we'll have that in stock and we'll ship it right away. But then, and of course, it's all with the best intentions. And then there was another one of this areas of the department, the climate department, that said, well, we've been tasked with reducing the working capital. And for us to reduce the working capital, we actually need to reduce the inventory levels, right? So you see there two teams, all with the best intentions at heart, all trying to help the organization that might be looking at initiatives that actually kind of counter-match each other. One of them wants to increase inventory to improve customer satisfaction. The other one wants to reduce inventory to improve working capital, to reduce working capital. Which one of them is better? That's not for us to judge at the beginning, but that is the type of things that we need to identify at this point in phase and bring to the attention of the team and bring to the attention of the Mars team and the different C-suite for every organization, and come to an agreement, come to a decision as to what are we going to be doing and how can we make sure that we are hitting the strategic objectives for the organization, even with some of those sometimes contrasting objectives or goals that we're trying to retrace.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So in this last,
so once you have that,
oh my bad,
sorry,
go ahead.
Yeah, all right. So as you're going out of this formulation phase, this is like the first time that you're actually going to be stepping out of your base camp rate. So you have everything ready, you packed your bags, but you actually need to step out and start walking and start hiking up the mountain, trying to reach that summit, right? So that is the execution of the strategy, which is a very important portion. Everything that has happened up to this point has, again, happened in your base camp. Perhaps it's taken you a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but then the rest of the strategic cycle, that might be the rest of the quarter, the rest of the semester, the rest of the year, whatever that is, you're actually going to be working on executing. And as you're executing, you'll need to constantly analyze if you're getting closer to where you want to get, and to continue to move along this strategic cycle that we'll be talking about, Ray.
Yeah, and there are pretty much three main things that we want to focus on when we execute. Depending on your organization, you might not need to do all three of these. If the data shows most of you fall into a medium-sized organization, so you might need these, you might not. If you do manage your own business and you want to grow your business, you might not need to think about change management. You might not think about launching and communicating. but you sure will need to think about strategic governance. But these are the three elements that we kind of touch on this module, if you will, on this phase. How are we going to launch and communicate the strategy? You've built the strategy with only a handful of people in your organization. So how are you going to get everyone else on board? That's kind of what we touch on in Launch and Communicate. This is heavily related to the last one on change management. You will have resistance to change. No one really likes change. It's just innate in our human nature. So how can we reduce the adverse effects of a strategy? One of your strategies may remove some headcount. So how are you going to manage those difficult situations? And that's kind of what we touch on change management. And I know I jumped there, but the middle one is strategic governance. You have to understand the performance of your strategy, right? So how are we going to manage these objectives? How are we going to structure our governance? One of the ways that we do it is through structuring these dashboards. And how will Javier, can you touch on a little bit about how we might structure these dashboards and what do we use for that?
Absolutely. So the idea here is that strategy tracking, strategic management actually does not get more convoluted and complicated for the organization, but that we can actually enhance the day-to-day operations of the organization with simple to use tools for strategic management, right? So we actually represent a software and we have a partnership with them that we can present to some of our clients, but you're not required to use that. The idea is that you're able to identify what are the most important KPIs, how are you going to be tracking them, and that you're able to ingrain strategy and strategic alignment and strategic dashboards with your already happening meetings. Probably even take a look and cleaning that meeting schedule and not filling it more with additional strategy meetings, but making sure that every one of those meetings, every one of those day-to-day operational meetings is actually working towards what we need to do in order for us to improve your strategic tracking.
Yeah. And I know we touched on a lot here. We're wrapping up the webinar session here. You know, we touched on 5 elements that are critical to every strategy, and you could spend hours and hours talking into each one of those elements. You know, what we encourage you guys to do is first follow us on any social media. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, and we're on LinkedIn. Follow, you know, me and Javier. We're both on LinkedIn, so feel free to give us a follow over there on LinkedIn. We share a lot of different types of content. We dive into each of these 5 elements more in depth in different blogs and different resources. So do give us a follow and look us up on those social media platforms. And please let us know if you'd like us to focus on one specific aspect of our process here. Whether you're struggling with identifying where you're at, whether it's struggling with launching your strategy, whether it's struggling on defining those strategies, we can focus on one of those aspects depending on your needs. And we can do a session like this again where we touch on one of those aspects, because we can get really in depth into each of these phases, right?
Absolutely. And Henry here, he's sharing some information about our sales phase program. If you can hang tight just for a minute, I'll jump into strategic barometer that I know that promised at the beginning, so you can kind of make this self-assessment. But if you do decide to go there, well, as Ray's saying, the QRs there will take us to our LinkedIn profiles, where we'll be very happy to connect with you. But also, if you are interested and if you care to take a look at our self-paced program, we delve much deeper into every one and a few more of the topics that we've covered here. Here, we've only have a little under an hour to very quickly go through the overall concept of strategic management trade. But there we have 40 plus hours of training with supporting articles, case studies, videos, very professionally recorded sessions where you're able to go through all that content at your own pace, and at a very attractive price, by the way, because of our launching promotion. So if you're interested in any of that, or as you were saying, Ray, into getting a little bit more granular or a little bit more detail into anything that we've talked about today, please do reach out. If you're here live, make sure that you leave us your email. We should have that already. But if you're interested in getting any of this, and if you weren't able to join us, but if you're watching this recording, hopefully you can also get in touch with us, send us an email, send us a message. The links will be out there, or just look for us, our website or social media platforms, and you should be able to get a hold of us really, really easy.
Great.
Okay. All right. So I think that the one thing that we have left for today, Ray, is to share this strategic management barometer. And this is for every one of you to kind of do this self-assessment. One of the very first questions that we typically get is, why is the scale structure the way that it is? Why do you have like the more extreme values, one of the almost left, one of the almost right, and kind of this green in the middle? Well, because that is precisely what we're trying to find. Typically, Ray, what happens is we would have two kind of organizations that get close to us at the beginning. I mean, we have organizations of different sizes and types and the different levels, but it's very common at the very beginning that we either get organizations that want to get started in the strategic journey, so they don't have much information, and they would qualify as what we call a beginner level. So not sure what to measure, what the right indicators are. Not everyone within the organization has worked with DNA or strategic DNA concepts before. There is a big vision, or perhaps there's a clear vision, but it's only in the head of a few within the organization. Strategy is also only known to a few members. So there's very little in terms of strategy, but there is the intent to get there. So if you're here, you're most likely in the beginner phase. Now, because there is so much information out there, so many tools, so much literature that you can start reading about, typically what happens is when organizations want to get into this strategic management process, they start getting some of this information, and now they want to do all of it. They want to implement everything. They want to use every tool, and they start having this attempt to manage strategy, doing a little bit of everything. And then they read Jim Collins with the Big Hairy Audacious Goal, or James Doerr with the OKRs, or Kaplan Norton with Balanced Scorecard. And they are not really sure how to connect everything, but they start wanting to do a little bit of everything, right? Using tools that perhaps are not the most efficient for strategic management, which are not bad, but at a point, they'll become not very useful for us. So continue to manage your strategy only using Microsoft Excel or PowerPoint or similar pieces of software. Not everyone within the organization is understanding the strategy. Now you didn't measure a lot during the beginner. Now you start measuring a lot of information, but you're not using that information for decision making. So you've basically gone right from one side, one extreme to the other. And this is why this other extreme is actually not the advanced level, but this is the intermediate level. What we're trying to help you reach is the healthiest advanced level, which is right in the middle, Ray. How can we make sure that your strategy is simple yet effective, Ray?
Yeah, and that's all about having well-defined KPIs. You don't want to measure every single thing. You want to find your vital signs. A solid idea of a vision and a mission, and having everyone in the organization know that. A well-structured plan that's actually followed up on, not a structured plan and then it's just tucked away. That's kind of where we want to be. Strategic management and having an effective strategy is a balance. It's not, either all the way to one side or all the way to the other side. It's actually a middle ground there, and that's where we want to find ourselves. So, do some self-reflection and think about where your organization stands. Think about where your business stands, and kind of find those ways to kind of get back into the middle ground. And again, it's all about having those well-defined KPIs, having strategic management embedded in our culture, and a solid understanding of our organizational DNA.
All right, well, that is it for today from our side. Once again, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for being here. We're gonna be stopping the recording now, but if you have any questions, if you want to get in touch with us, we'll stay here for a few more minutes. Also, all the links are out there for the training itself, for getting in touch with us, for sending us a message. There's the course guide also for you to be able to download it. You will be getting this recording via email. Well, perhaps if you're hearing this in a recording, it's a little bit too late already, but then you'll also be able to download the course guide from our website, resources, etc. All right. Well, thank you very much. You have a great night, Ray. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon or whatever time you're watching this, and hope to see you as part of our self-paced program very soon.
Thank you all for joining.